So a lot of people have never seen this. A treat. Maybe a little of the background.
If you'd like to
well,
start that way.
The front page was Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur's play that was in 1928. It was a big hit as a play. It was their, they had worked together on the Chicago newspaper, and it was their Valentine to the newspaper room, but also obviously a portrait, not a very flattering portrait of the newsmen who are, they're unscrupulous, they lie, they're bigoted, they're just outrageous, but at the same time. And what happened was, so this was a hit play. It was made into a movie with Adolphe Menjou as the editor and Pat O'Brien as the star reporter. And the same thing, Menjou is even, if you can imagine, even more unscrupulous than Cary Grant, and having the train stopped and having stolen goods on him to keep him there, to keep him from getting married. And the story is, the story that Hawks gave out was that he was reading the script and having a secretary or some woman, the only one that was there, having her read the reporter part, and that's where he got the idea of changing the reporter from a man to a woman. But it's the kind of thing Hawks would have done anyway, because he always, Hawks was a master of every genre. He did gangster films, he did film noir, he discovered Lauren Bacall and To Have and Have Not, he did Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and the screwball comedies he did were Bringing Up Baby with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. And that, too, is just incredibly fast-paced. At the end, you're kind of exhausted. It's just, it never stops. It's a perpetual motion machine, and this more than ever. And the play, the front page was that way, too. It just sort of builds and builds and builds and never stops. But another interesting thing was that he offered the part to several actresses who turned it down. And to me, it's so perfect, Rosalind Russell, because she wasn't an actress with, the other possibilities were, well, Katharine Hepburn, I think, could have done it, but I can't imagine some of the other people considered Jean Arthur and Carole Lombard. But Rosalind Russell has this kind of swagger. And she's also a little bit gawky. You can imagine her as this sort of brainy person. And that moment when, she's can't wait to be a normal person and all that, and then she hears the sirens and the gunshots, and she suddenly takes off the hat and starts running into something a little bit clumsy about her in her high heels. And I don't know, I think what she lacks in maybe conventional sex appeal, she makes up in something else. So this kind of verve and the words or the eros in this movie, this was during the time of the production code where you couldn't, which is one of the things that gave rise to screwball comedies, because you couldn't have sex. You could, it was absolutely the Hayes office had these puritanical strictures about what could and couldn't be shown. So you couldn't have sex, so you had instead talking and acting. And in the screwball comedy, the women gave as good as they got. So that was what was exciting, that they were really equal. And here, I think of all of them, you really feel that the eros is the words, is the byplay, is the one-upmanship. They love one-upping each other, but they also love being one-upped by the other.
Right.
Yeah. So.
We're obviously very distracted, wonderfully, by the fast-paced, overlapping dialogue. But what Hawks does here, too, is he uses the other elements of filmmaking so beautifully. The choreography of the characters within the frame and the framing itself, and the editing. There's only a little bit of music at the end.
Yeah.
But
and it's all inside. It's all interior. There's one sort of pseudo-exterior shot, but it really is all taking place in basically 1 or 2 rooms.
Right.
And it has Joseph Walker, the cinematographer, who did a lot of film noir, so it even has a little bit of a kind of noir aspect. And, of course, this very serious story of Earl Williams. So it's, there is, I think, also in Hawks, there's a little cruelty in a lot of the screwball comedies, and I think part of that is it's sort of anti-sentimentality. It's sort of cutting against the sentimentality, but there is a kind of cruelty, and we're implicated in it. Cary Grant is so awful to everybody. He's so completely, but he plays it so almost deliberately hyperbolic. His eyes are bulging, and he does all this acting. He's just nonstop. So you sort of get into his rhythm, but he really is sort of brutal to poor Ralph Bellamy. And if you saw The Awful Truth, it's the same dynamic again. The Ralph Bellamy is the sap that gets walked over by everybody.
So, do you think that Cary Grant is a perfect, works very well in the Hawks universe of the male camaraderie offset by the
Well, it's
the
interesting
romantic?
because in in Bringing Up Baby, Katharine Hepburn is the real dynamo, the aggressor in a way. I mean, she's this kind of Connecticut lady who's very awkward. I mean, again, you have these women who are very verbal and very physical, but also a little bit awkward in certain ways. And Katharine Hepburn is like that. And poor Cary Grant in that film, he's a paleontologist who's looking for this dinosaur bone. And he's a very nerdy guy, and she's just dragging him through the wilds of Connecticut as it is there. And he's the sort of victim in a way. So it's a little bit of a reversal. This is where he can do anything, I think. He's great in Hitchcock films. He's great under so many different directors. But I think this is maybe a little bit the wildest performance. He's acting. She says, stop acting, but he is acting all the time, and he's deliberately acting all the time, and he sort of gets away with it, I think.
Well, you sort of, you studied Cary Grant. I mean, who could blame you? And you've been writing about him. Tell us about the transition from screwball comedy to his more dramatic roles.
Well, first the transition to screwball. I don't know how many of you saw the Awful Truth, which is, I think, another thing. These films never got nominated for Academy Awards, and to me, they're some of the greatest films in American cinema. But of course, comedy is never taken seriously. But in 1 year, almost 1 year, the Shop Around the Corner, the Ernst Lubitsch comedy, Bringing Up Baby, and the Preston Sturges movie, The Lady Eve, all opened sort of in almost simultaneously, and none of them got an Academy Award. The only nomination was for the story of The Lady Eve. So these great films that were never taken seriously at the time, of course, they've enchanted audiences ever since. But in The Awful Truth, Leo McCarey was known for improvisation. He had directed Laurel and Hardy shorts. He came out of silent comedy, so he had fantastic time, and he loved to just play around. He would get on the set and play the piano. And so this is what he wanted to do. And Cary Grant came into this having done just a few. His most famous role was with Mae West and which one is it? I'm No Angel, I think. One of those two. So he was a kind of a gorgeous leading man in that, but he wasn't Cary Grant. So he came into this, and he was very uncomfortable with this idea of improvisation, and so was Irene Dunne. And by the time they started doing it, so there's a moment really in there where he sort of becomes Cary Grant, the antic Cary Grant, and you can just see him suddenly becoming physical and ridiculous. And the thing is, they love. Another thing about Screwball is they don't mind looking ridiculous. They don't mind looking silly. And this is what they have over everybody else. Everybody else is sort of self-serious and earnest, and these people are just letting rip with it. And so Cary Grant and Irene Dunne are fantastic. So then, he does that, but he also has the thing that Hitchcock gets out of him in something like North by Northwest is this kind of, by this time he really is a leading man, and he's always immaculate. Well, he always is that anyway. He's always most beautifully dressed. But Hitchcock plays on the kind of complacency, kind of male complacency that he comes in North by Northwest. And there too, what they both use is this star power and also the kind of underside of it, or the implications of it, in Hitchcock, you have some of these villains that are really more sympathetic than Grant. There's something smug about him in North by Northwest, and in Notorious. He's great, and also in Notorious. So I think both of these directors get so much out of him in such different ways.
Yeah. We were talking about the fact that it's so fast-paced. Do you think that it was speeded up at some point by the sound people?
Well,
because the pace.
The front page is fast too. It really. This is faster. That whole thing when the tobacco thing they do. But these people that could say the dialogue. You can't. This young woman called me to interview me for the Sag Harbor paper about. She said, "Well, what will this show people today?" Or I think she meant young people. I thought I don't know if they can relate to it at all, because we some of us grew up listening to this, or at least we heard it at a certain point in our lives when people talked a lot. There was a lot of dialogue, but this is beyond almost anything. I mean, I don't know how, and Rosalind Russell too, I just don't know how they even get it out so fast, and yet you hear and overlapping, and yet you hear it all.
Well, apparently somebody did a count. It's 240 words a minute.
Oh, really?
And actually, American conversation is 140 words a minute.
That's so
So
interesting.
I think I'm with the sound man.
They speeded it
Yeah,
up.
doing some tricks.
I mean, you think they speeded it up after? You speeded it up.
Well, I was having discovered this, I was looking at the film, and they tell people, the people who are in the room while the dialogue is going quickly, not to move around too much because it might look funny. Because I think that
they were going to play around with it.
Think,
yeah,
who
that's
knows?
really interesting.
But
yeah.
it's fun. I had watching this. I was upset, of course, about Molly Malone's suicide, and even more so about the fact that nobody paid attention to it afterwards.
Well,
Did that bother you?
Well, they say she's breathing, so
Yeah.
that's all that matters. She's breathing, and the mother, Ralph Bellamy's mother's breathing. I mean, they're practically dead, but I know it's very. It's very callous.
Yeah.
And that's the point that Hector MacArthur made about them. I mean, the ruthlessness of this, what they do. The other thing is, the love between them is expressed in words, in the words. There's something, and also, I don't think Hawks is one, but it's also the love of work, the excitement of work. But also, I think some people criticize the ending when she cries, but to me, Hawks is never great at endings because he really doesn't believe in a happy ending. He believes they're going to go right on and divorcing and remarry. It's just going to go on like this. It's not. It doesn't have a climax, and so he's not. Many of his films just stop. But to me, it's like she's gone through. Everybody's gone through a lot, but she's gone through this roller coaster of emotions, and suddenly she's just wiped out.
Yeah.
She thinks he really doesn't want her, and yet she doesn't know what to. And then she moves on. So to me, there's something right. It feels right. That ending feels right.
It does, because it isn't the traditional romantic comedy ending.
Yeah.
They don't look at each other in the eyes. They don't
That's right.
embrace.
They don't.
He runs out of the room before her. She's carrying her suitcase.
Yeah.
So it isn't traditional, but it does feel right.
Well, and I guess you could say she capitulates, but in a way I don't think you can see it quite in those terms because it's just such an unconventional relationship all the way around.
I was at the Museum of Modern Art the other night, and I noticed there was a quote of yours from your book, From Reverence to Rape, painted on the wall. And right next to it was a poster of his girl Friday. It was really a great delight for me. I'd just like to read you the quote and see how that relates to the Rosalind Russell character. Far more than men, women were vessels of men's and women's fantasies and the barometers of changing fashion. Women in the movies reflected, perpetrated, and in some respects offered innovations on the role of women in society.
Offered what?
Offered innovations on the role of women in society. Is the Rosalind Russell character pointing to a new modern woman?
Well, there were newspaper. Katharine Hepburn plays a newspaper woman in Woman of the Year. And some people said that the Rosalind Russell character was based on a woman called Adela Rogers St. John. I don't know if that name means it. She was a reporter in the 20s and 30s, and apparently even the outfit was supposedly based on the way she wore. There was this kind of slightly mannish outfit
With the stripes, the
with
chevron
the
stripes.
and the great and the fabulous hat. Yeah. Yes, of course, they were. I think that. The point some people would make of, say, the screwball comedies is that women were, first of all, a lot of times they were sort of lived on park. They weren't worried about money. They didn't have to, and they didn't have children. All the screwball comedies are couples without children, so there are no encumbrances and there's no desperation. They're living a high life. But what Stanley Cavell that you mentioned earlier called it the comedy of remarriage. He wrote a series of essays called The Comedy of Remarriage. He thought it was the most important. He was a philosopher. He taught philosophy at Harvard. But he thought this was the most important genre in Hollywood because he felt that it was a reconfiguring of marriage. And the remarriage is you've gotten married the first time, you don't know what you're doing. You haven't discovered the degree to which you are meant for each other. So the whole movie is this is this butting up against the first marriage. I mean, some of the movies, they weren't technically remarried, but it was the same idea. They had to re-find each other and discover that this is what that how much they can tolerate, how much they can forgive of each other. And he felt it was reconfiguring marriage in America on a more equal basis, because marriage had heretofore been on property and all of these other conventions. So it was something, he felt it was something very new and very American in that.
Yeah. And from what I understand, too, Hawks liked the women with the strong edge, but he liked them as pretty young women.
Yeah.
So he had to train them to be someone who had the allure of an experienced and wise woman. In fact, the story is, and it's actually been confirmed the other night, I had dinner with somebody who was in, an old friend. I had no idea she was in a Howard Hawks movie. And she talked about the fact that she was a pretty young woman, model, and to get her voice lower, which is very much a part of it, he made her scream and scream and scream until she was hoarse. And that was what he did with Lauren Bacall, too, to bring her voice down. So he really had a type, in a way, where they looked great, maybe less so with Rosalind Russell. She had her own strength, but they, and maybe Katharine Hepburn as well, but they had the wisdom of an older woman.
Well, one of the two, what I consider the first two screwball comedies are It Happened One Night and 20th Century. And Hawks directed 20th Century with Carol Lombard and John Barrymore, and she's the actress and he's the sort of Svengali actor, both of them very narcissistic, and they're this train ride where they just go at it at each other. It's so physical. They're both very physical, and that was sort of Carol Lombard coming into her own as a comedian. And then in Nothing Sacred, she's somebody, I mean, normally you would think this beauty, she doesn't have to do anything except talk, but she didn't. She did things. She acted. She became physical. So Hawks loved that. And yes, he would groom them. And as you say, Lauren Bacall into Heaven Not, that was her first film, and her first film with Bogart. So there's a lot going on there. And then they did The Big Sleep together under Hawks. And in The Big Sleep, there are all sorts of beautiful women here and there. And one of them's an intellectual in a bookstore. But I mean, so he was notorious. But it wasn't just, he wanted something more. He wanted them to be sort of either brainy or fast talking or have gumption, or they were great spirits in their own right.
Yeah. So what are the other qualities of Hawks that has put him in the pantheon of great American directors?
Well, he's versatile. As I say, he directed all different genres. The Western, he did Rio Bravo. I don't know if anybody of you have seen that, but he loved Red River was a great Western with John Wayne and Montgomery Clift, and he was great at men's relationships too. Now they talk about bromance, the buddy film. That's why I think he saw in the front page it was a buddy film, and of course he knew both sides of that, the male-female and the male-male. So I think he also always had a sense of vulnerability too, that in the later films especially, you see them getting old. I think there's a lot of sort of subtext in Hawks. But, basically it is these, like in Rio Bravo, it's John Wayne and Angie Dickinson and this teasing, the couple. It's something you don't have anymore, really. There were so many movies of different genres revolved around the couple. Now it's much more diverse and maybe more interesting in some ways, less in others. But there was that couple at the center, and I think whereas say John Ford had a much more traditional view of men and women, a much more sort of what Stanley Cavell was saying that the screwball comedy was getting away from, where men and women had separate roles. There was this overlapping, and what Hawks also saw, this could be threatening to men too. And he took that into account, the threat. John Wayne has to go through he's teased by Angie Dickinson, and there's a kind of a reckoning. The man has to reckon with the strength of the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to open it up?
Sorry?
Oh, we're going to open it up or not?
Oh, well, I
Supposed to do
just have a couple more
that? Oh,
questions.
okay, okay.
And another quote, too. I'm freezing. I don't know if anybody else is here.
It's for men. There.
Oh, it's for men.
It's
yeah.
a double standard. It lives on in air conditioning.
Right. But I just wanted to point out that you're a close observer of European films as well as American films. How does Hawks differentiate himself from his European contemporaries?
Well, the Nouvelle Vague, the Truffaut and Godard and all of Chabrol and Romer, they were all film critics before they became directors, and they saw American films that they began this whole idea of the auteur, the director being the auteur, the author of the film. They saw after the war that all the films had been held up during the war, and afterwards they saw just one after another of these American films by Hawks and Ford, and they just loved them. And they began to see patterns in the different directors because they were seeing them all together. And they wrote about this, and then Andrew, as Wendy mentioned, my husband, Andrew Saris, developed this, the Politique des Auteurs, in the American cinema that he wrote. And so what they saw was these certain themes, that these directors were working in what they thought was a studio system. So it was sort of like practically a factory, and yet, even though it was the studio, they weren't out on their own doing independent films. They were at studios with producers overhead and writers and so forth. But there would be consistent themes in each of them. And so they wrote about this, and they really loved Hawks. And Hawks would have been somebody who maybe the critics of the time, Bosley Crowell and the various other critics, didn't take seriously. He was part of this American cinema. He made westerns. Nobody took westerns seriously. But Andrew and others saw that this was art. If it was comedy, but it was art. And I think still, like the Academy doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Doesn't get the artistry. All of Cary Grant never got. I mean.
But what they did too, they didn't only write about Howard Hawks and bring him to the attention of the American critical community, but they encouraged, the Museum of Modern Art did a full retrospective, and Dan Talbot did a series of Howard Hawks just as an effort to reintroduce him to American audiences. So it's nice to have you sitting here with your husband, responsible for us sitting here, actually. Who knows? But I have another quote from Molly. I just can't resist. This is from page 1 of her book, From Reverence to Rape. And it is, "The big lie perpetrated on Western society is the idea of women's inferiority, a lie so deeply ingrained in our social behavior that merely to recognize it is to risk unraveling the entire fabric of civilization." Now, in your book, you were tracing the decline of the portrayal of women in film from the 30s and 40s to the 60s and 70s. And what I'd like to know is whether you think, what are the arcs of the treatment of women in film following the 60s and 70s up to the present, if that's not
that's
too...
That's a lot. Well, the 70s was interesting because that was when the people like Scorsese and Coppola and Brian De Palma, all these guys, so there was this weird financing thing where studios put money into independent films, Cassavetes, Altman, so there were these really interesting directors making personal films, which were exciting and interesting, but not really that great for women, because the funny thing is, under the studio system, they were under contract, they were trying to appeal to audiences. Often it was thought that it was the women who decided what a couple would go to see. So women were a target audience, and women got equal salaries, and they really were, as far as payment and exposure, on a par with men. Then these directors came along. They didn't care about appealing to women in the audience, and their films were very male-oriented. And then, of course, we got into the Star Wars and Close Encounters and science fiction and fantasy, and the youth audience, which was young men, basically. Yeah. So all of those genres. So, I mean, still there were good actresses and making films, but there was what there wasn't is like the star persona. I mean, where you had, say, Bette Davis or Rosalind Russell or Jimmy Stewart. I mean, or just to stay with the women, they would have, or Joan Crawford, you sort of knew what to expect. They had a persona that carried from film to film. And sometimes they chafed against this. They wanted to stretch or deviate from it. But this was something audiences understood and could identify with. Then when you had a kind of free agent system, Meryl Streep would do one kind of film, then another kind of role. So there wasn't that, there was more freedom in a way, but less security. And they just weren't used as much, you know.
And is that better for the audience, or for? I mean, it's better for the actress.
Well, I don't think it wasn't that great because there was a year when one of the critics groups, I can't remember the year, but it was the year of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it was the 70s. Anyway, somebody suggested, because everybody by this time, when I first started writing about this in the early 70s, everybody thought it was wrong. Certainly the feminists did, because they thought, of course, now that we've gotten away from these bad old studios, the women are doing better and more interesting and progressive and all that. And I said, no, well, the opposite is true. And then the realization, other people sort of agreed. And so somebody suggested we not give a prize, a Best Actress award that year as a protest, as the dearth of good women's parts. And I said, well, that's penalizing the actress for something that's not her fault. There was some great, there was Ellen Burstyn and Jessica Lange and Sissy Spacek. They were doing Meryl Streep, and there were a lot of really good films and really good women's parts. It's just that you didn't have as many you just didn't have as many films being made, and as many, and I do think the emphasis on the youth audience in science fiction and Marvel, all of that, what we know is of the sort of blockbuster type of film of today, was inimical to grown-up stories about men and women.
Yeah, right. So let's take some questions. Who would like to begin? Yes.
How resonant is this in the era of fake news and our would he love it and say?
Well, I know. I was thinking they should show this on Fox News, and they say, yeah, see, this is what the press is like.
Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah.
It's how relevant is this film to fake news?
How resonant?
Oh, resonant.
Resonant. So I guess this would give glee to Trump and his supporters, except that this is not the kind of fake news that he's talking about, but it is. There was a kind of yellow press journalism, which I think actually, and especially big city journalism, this is wildly exaggerated, but they were cynical, and it was cynical. But I don't think that part, of course, I think there's a different thing in journalism today, which is, I won't get into that, but I don't know. What does anybody else think of that?
Speaking of journalists, you made the point in your book that the responsibility for the stereotyping of the roles of women in film was not only laid at the feet of the filmmakers, the screenwriters and the directors, but by the male critics who were reinforcing and not challenging these at the time, and also admiring the pretty actresses at length.
Well, Laura Mulvey coined the term the male gaze, the idea, G-A-Z-E, the idea that women are always this object of a gaze of lust, or that women were designed as objects of desire, and so this robbed them of their subjectivity. And I think, yes, this is true. But as you said earlier, I also wanted to suggest that even within this parameter, women were able to get their own back in certain ways. I don't know if you've ever heard this, Alison Bechdel. She has that line about that women in movies, women, they have to be, I knew it, but I forgot. Women, as many women as men, and they have to talk to each other. Women have to talk to each other, have as many lines of dialogue as the men, and talk about something other than men. So that was her idea. That was sort of the basis. But often you can have a woman that doesn't have that much dialogue, but she has presence. I think there's something more subtle and nuanced. Yes, she can be the object of, the men are too. We look at Cary Grant. This is what I didn't like about the Laura Mulvey thing, because I think, first of all, the identifications we identify with both sexes, and we desire both sexes. I think that's what's exciting about movies. So it's not just that women identify with women on the screen and men with men, or that men just feel desire for women. It's a very complicated and it's a more nuanced transaction, I think, is what's
Yeah.
going on. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Yes.
How successful and popular was this movie when it was released, and how did it compare to the stage play?
To what?
The stage play.
Oh. Well, it's hard to say. The stage play was very successful. I'm not sure about that. I know that Bringing Up Baby, Hawks' movie with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, was not, because it was too abrasive. I think Hawks is relentless. That's something relentless in that pacing. And also, it's making fun of all the people that are that would be going to see the movie,
Yeah.
in Middle America or something. But I think it was.
It had good reviews, and it
Yeah.
opened to enthusiastic audiences at Radio City Music Hall in 1940.
Billy Wilder did a remake of The Front Page later with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon, which was not very good.
No, and Susan Sarandon played the Ralph Bellamy part.
Yeah.
And actually, I asked her if she would join me in a tribute to Jack Lemmon. She said no. They kept me out of the picture. They were playing cards. I mean, it was like reliving the actual film.
Well, in The Front Page, I mean, I was watching it recently. It is so misogynist.
Yes.
There's a moment where Adolphe Monjus, Pat O'Brien wants to get with his fiancée, and another guy wants to get with his woman, and Adolphe Monjus says, "Oh, you women lovers." I mean, that's the worst thing he can say. And the thing that have you seen it recently?
Yeah.
So O'Brien is trying to get away. His fiancée says, "Oh, the only reason you want to marry me is to get back at Walter O'Brien." No, I want to live like a real person. And so then you see him helping her pack. And there are all these lingerie, so it's like the wussiest thing that they can make him do is help her pack her lingerie in this suitcase. He's got to get his, cajones back by going back. But it's very sort of gleefully misogynist.
Right.
The front page.
And then there was actually, that same year that it was released, there was a radio play with Claudette Colbert and Fred McMurray. I think it may be on the Criterion Collection DVD.
I like it. Yeah, I'd like to hear
And
because they did radios of most of these things.
yeah,
all through the
and
line.
actually these two, Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant, reprised their role on the radio too.
Well, what's so exciting is you see Cary Grant with so much different, with a different chemistry with each actress that he works with, and the actresses too. I mean, this is
Yeah.
what's so fascinating. You have these people that do have a sort of consistent persona from film to film, and yet something in the interaction, the chemistry, and the dynamic, it's unique. Yeah.
Yes, Gillian.
Yeah, I was sort of curious because I was thinking about the sort of process of lots of it being written many times. And one of the reasons why the dialogue is so superb. But also I heard that Rosalind Russell had her own writer because Cary Grant had better lines.
Yes, I read that too. Yeah, I did too. It was somebody. They would do this quite often, I think, on the set. Somebody would feel that way, and yeah, I think she was reluctant to take the part. It was not like anything she'd ever done, and she could see that it was going to be. It's a little terrifying to get there with Cary. You know, Cary Grant can do all this, and you've got to hold your own against him, and she does it. So, bravo to her, I think.
Well, and because Hawks asked for his actors to improvise, she had the opportunity to bring in her own lines. And apparently it was her brother-in-law who was in PR or something. I believe it, I'll believe all these stories. Yes. Yes.
I wondered if any of the reviewers at the time took after Rosalind Russell's character for being ambitious, since Walter actually appealed to her ambition, which supersedes her desire to get married and have a child, which we don't really get the picture she's really very interested in. So you go decades after, up until just this most recent generation of millennials, women were still totally ripped apart for being
They were penalized.
use that word.
They were, and they had to capitulate in the end always, and usually to give it up. But I think one of the things here is that she really has this humanity that the others don't have. There's something very feminine and empathetic about her, and she brings that into the newsroom. So I think that softening and that her relationship with Earl Williams and Molly Malloy are like the best of womanhood. So I think that in a way allows her to be ambitious, and then in the end she does kind of collapse, so that's feminine. But in that Woman of the Year, they make, I'm sure you've seen it, they make Katharine Hepburn make breakfast in the end to show that she's just a housewife, you know. So nothing like that, you don't have to have that. And yeah, back of that.
I had seen this film before, only on the small screen, so it's great to see it on the big screen. But there's something, it's a very, very minor thing in the sort of arc of the film, but the issue of race. You know,
Oh, yeah.
there's a lot of throwaway lines about the color police.
Well, yeah, I think anybody's going to pick it. Yeah, well, this is.
Modern sensibility, it seems odd, but okay, fine. But then the thing that really got me was the pickaninny. And I just thought that
I know.
awareness at the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, movies are worse than that. I mean, it could have been a lot worse. Yeah. I mean, I know. This is one of the terrible things, and I hope we don't stop looking at old movies because of this. Yeah, these moments of outrageous bigotry in movies and racism and all of that. So many movies of the past have that in one form or another, and I think it is very troubling, especially to younger viewers. I think we've gone through it. We still sort of cringe, but we've gone through it. But I think young viewers today, it is jarring, at the very least. No, isn't it? Oh, okay. This is this. Yeah, I can tell.
Well, it was interesting when I heard it. I thought, oh, would some people not show this film? And I thought, you know, that would be a shame. But then I mean, I could see it both ways. You know,
I think that we just have to accept occasionally being uncomfortable. I mean, it's not terrible. We don't have to be comfortable all the time, and we don't have to feel righteous all the time. We have to. This is our past. Yeah, I think.
Yes.
I saw these scenes that were very long. It looked like they were one camera covering them, and yet they were doing the dialogue very fast. So it's very different than the way things are shot today, with different angles, straightened up. So they had to do these ways people want to take.
Right. I know. That's the other thing. These long takes, and they're right on the people. They don't have covering shots. Hawks was famous for his sort of eye level. I mean, Ford had sort of panoramic views and was much more pictorial a director. Hawks was just right up there with his men and women. And that's the intensity of it. It's just amazing that they could do it now. I mean, because I think you're absolutely right. They're doing it then. They're not having cover. They're not having different takes. It's just all continuous. I mean, that's the feeling of it. It's just nonstop.
Yeah, that's why the blocking and the framing and the choreography of it is so astonishing, really, because it's in such tight interiors, and he manages. Apparently, he was an engineer by training.
Was it?
Yeah.
Well, he also loved to fly, and a lot of his films are about flying. He was a sportsman. He was a real adventurer. He was like the governor off fishing.
Yeah. Right. Any other questions? Yes.
How much do you, the art of football comedy impacted all these, many of these plays redone, the dialogue and everything?
Well, what do you make of the fact that so many of these are adapted from plays? Well, for one thing, when movies went to sound in the 30s, naturally that was when a huge number of New Yorkers of every description went out to Hollywood. So there were playwrights and the acting and the people who could speak. So they really went for sound in a big way. So I think it's partly that they were from plays, but others are not so much. And I don't know, The Awful Truth. The Awful Truth was a play much earlier in the 20s, and it had a very different kind of life and form to it. This is one of the most, in a way, most faithful to a play. But these were natural sources for sound film, and then you got this, and then the combination of that and the production code. So the films had to figure out ways to express attraction without having any sexuality, and so you get these verbal pyrotechnics.
Yes.
Well, I sometimes wonder if the
Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah, she want an overview of sort of how things are different today and whether I could have anticipated it. I don't think anyone could have anticipated what the world is like now. It is, I wonder sometimes if the past can even teach us anything. First of all, I think there's so much present. There's so much going on. There's streaming and there's technology and there's the people are on a device or something all the time. I think some of the streaming things are brilliant. I think one of the things is that people seem more, and I think this has been going on for a while, but suddenly things became more demographic. Hollywood was going for the young male viewer worldwide, and so hence all these action films and franchises that have very little dialogue, and so they don't have to be translated into other languages that they're universally comprehensible. So that's one huge part of the biggest part of the market. Genres that weren't that popular when I was coming along now are horror for one, fantasy for another. I can't, except for once in a while, I'll find a horror film that I really love. This Ari Aster, I think, is really interesting. He did Hereditary. Now he's got this new one, Midsummer, which I haven't seen. But I think different genres have come to the fore. I guess a lot of actresses are doing Marvel action films, and I think Scarlett Johansson at one time was the biggest paid actress in Hollywood, and it was for Avengers. It's something I've never even seen her in. So there are all these actors that are doing things that I never see, and I find that, I'll find an English actor that I like, and I'd say, well, where? And then he's been in some kind of one of these franchise films or one of these superhero films. So I think I can just, I sort of try to keep up. And I think the portrait of women is, of course, much more diverse, of race. All of this, I think, is a good thing. Women filmmakers are increasing, especially non-American, but even American women filmmakers. So that I think is changing the picture. And I always thought it would, but we didn't know how, and we still don't. I don't know. I think there's so much talent. This Phoebe Waller-Hogg that did Fleabag, and she's doing this one, Killing Eve, which I'm not that crazy about, but it's quite interesting. I don't know. I just think the picture is so much broader now. It's hard to even get a grip on it, to get a grasp of it, because it's international. When I was coming along, I loved the period when I was first starting to write, which is the late 60s and early 70s, and it seemed like this complete just burst of cinema and cinema writing, but it was really small when you consider what's going on now. It was European. The New York Film Festival was mostly European films, a few Asian, a few Asian, and a few Latin American, but basically European. Now, it's just all over the map. And there are so many films that there are these esoteric films that a lot of them at the New York Film Festival that a general audience doesn't know about. I think it's a very fragmented audience now, so this is what's fun about this, because it's like we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think that happens that often now.
That's true. Any other questions? I'm sorry, Nick.
What do you think about the title? Changing it from the front page to His Girl Friday. It seems to me, when I watch the film, I feel like they're partners, and in the original, it was about two male partners.
Well,
I think the title was trying to make her seem less threatening.
no, I don't think so. I think it's, of course, we think of the term His Girl Friday. You asked about the title. Was it sort of demeaning or something? I think, first of all, it's ironic, I think, don't you?
Yeah.
Because we think of His Girl Friday as somebody making coffee and doing that, so it's ironic, and I think it's sort of a rich title in a way, because it's something that, I don't know, because it does conjure up something which the movie explodes to smithereens, that she's no Girl Friday. She's right up there with the best of them. I think also the admiration of the other guys is kind of wonderful, that they don't feel threatened by her, and they appreciate what she brings to the table that they don't have. So that's kind of a lovely thing there, I think. Yeah. So.
Yes, April.
Are there examples,
No, I think not really. I mean, almost every, like Western, there were a few Westerns in France, but basically the Western and the screwball are really distinctly and almost, I would say almost exclusively screwball. I mean, they're comedies. They're male-female comedies. They're British comedies with men and women. But no, it's actually an interesting question because I don't really think there are. There wasn't any attempt to. I think that this was sort of acknowledged as an American genre.
If that's true, I think we should be really proud.
Yeah, I do too. Well, that was Stanley Cavell was saying that this is the great American genre for a lot of reasons. But yeah, okay. I think
Good for us, yes. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And Molly, thank you. You are continuing to be back.